Thank you for all joining this afternoon and a very, very warm welcome from me. My name is Richard Everitt and I'm the Regional Director for Education for the British Council in the region we call Wider Europe, which includes all the countries who are participating today. A very, very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for coming and welcome to this 6th session of the British Council's Higher Education Dialogue Series, the Deep Dive. And this Deep Dive series is really a follow-up to the initial series that we had in May, which engaged with around 5,000 education officials and those who work in higher education across the countries of wider Europe. So a very, very warm welcome to you all for joining this afternoon. And this Deep Dive series is really focused around looking at very specific topics that we all have a shared interest in. And today we'll be exploring the fascinating area of measuring and improving graduate destinations and outcomes. And this is going to be such a fascinating dialogue and such a fantastic discussion. We've had wonderful speakers this afternoon to engage in this topic. And I suppose as the moderator with you this afternoon, the key question I'll constantly be returning to, and the critical question for us to discuss this afternoon, is really about how can universities enhance their brand by measuring graduate destinations and outcomes. So we're really going to focus a lot around the measurement of the graduate destinations and outcomes and the methodologies around that and the policies and strategies that support that. So that is going to be the real deep dive focus for this afternoon, and I look forward to the discussions coming. So your involvement with this is very important. It's not for you to sit back and to relax while you do other work. We really want you to kind of really engage with this because, as you've already seen from the first poll, we'll have lots of polls happening throughout the 1.5 hours with us. And also please use the chat function as well to raise your questions or comments as we go through. Don't worry about if they're big questions or just very small questions or just comments you have. Please feel free to use the chat function to raise them at any time. And if you like that comment or if you want me to raise as a question, you can have that functionality as well by giving it a thumbs up. Please, however, stay on mute as much as you can because we want to be able to hear our key speakers. And again, this session will last about 1.5 hours, and there is actually going to be it's going to be recorded. And there's also our marketing team will put together something called a spotlight report, which is kind of distilling all the key points raised today in a short report, which we can share afterwards. So that's what we're going to do. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I think I'm really looking forward to moderating, be with you this afternoon. So please take part, and I'm going to kick off by just introducing our first of 3 wonderful speakers we have today. We really couldn't have had a better spread because they're all experts in the field we're going to talk about. And I'm delighted, first of all, to introduce you to Martin Edmundson, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Gradcore, which is a UK-based social enterprise focused on transforming graduate recruitment and employability. Martin's the Chief Executive of this. He's also the Director of the Institute for Student Employers, and over the last 15 or 20 years has been focused on looking at strategies and models on graduate employability. And he's also advised our UK government here on strategies around graduate recruitment. He is well known to the British Council, a big friend of the British Council, and has worked also in parts of our region, engaged directly in places like Azerbaijan and Georgia. So Martin, a really warm welcome to you. Thank you for your time, and we look here for your opening 5-10 minutes comments. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here as well. So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm just going to share my slides for a moment. We're a social enterprise, and we're particularly interested in helping universities to, get their graduates into the best possible jobs they can and to make them as employable as possible. And we spend a lot of time working with universities on this. So just before I dive into giving a bit of an explanation of what different graduate outcomes and destinations models are around the world, you've all been completing a poll as we've been talking. So I was just wondering whether Summer, who's our colleague from the country director of the British Council in Azerbaijan, Summer. Hello, Summer. Is just going to share, I think, the results of the poll. And what we asked was really the nature of your current graduate outcomes or destinations collection. So I don't know if that's possible to share some of the headlines of that, Summer.
Yes, it is possible, Martin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in the first poll and letting us know the current situation of graduate destination data collection in your country. Martin, what we're seeing is a divide between either collecting this at the university level, which is the majority, and some countries or institutions don't collect the data currently. And interestingly, nobody has said this is collected at a national level amongst those who have. Is that surprising?
Well, that's really interesting, and I'll try and reflect on that in my slides now as we look at what other models there are around different parts of the world, if that's okay. So thank you, Summer. So when we look around the world, there really is a kind of wide range of approaches to collecting graduate destinations information. We all kind of realize that it's pretty important because, as Richard set the scene for today, it's all about how universities can enhance their brand by being able to kind of really rigorously claim that the graduates who study at their university go on to graduate level employment or successful employment, however that's defined, in the areas that you would hope for, and that bring, if you like, a reflected prestige to the university because of how they've impacted the employment prospects of their students and graduates. Now, when we're looking at these models, when we look around the world, we see a really wide range of things, but there's perhaps 4 or 5 main factors that go into the design of a graduate outcomes model or destinations model, whether that's at a university level or a national level. In the UK, we collect it centrally and nationally, although we used to collect it at a university level. So both models are possible. Partly it's about thinking about whether you do this formally or informally. So do you have a really structured survey, or do you perhaps just do things like harvest data from LinkedIn and things like that? Partly it's about thinking, do you source your data from graduates or from employers? And both are perfectly valid sources of information, but they have different strengths and weaknesses that we'll come on to through the discussion today. Do you do it at a fixed time point? So for example, at 6 months after graduation or 12 months after graduation, or do you try and have some kind of real-time data on this? And finally, do you feed in other linked data from perhaps your government systems or your university systems? So for example, in the UK, we take a feed from the UK's tax system to give us a readout on graduate salaries and earnings. So rather than collecting that via a survey of the graduates, we take that directly from tax data. Now, across Europe, there's a really wide range of models going around graduate destination collection. Some countries run a model similar to the UK, where it's done as a national survey, and others ask their individual universities to collect data and feed that into a sort of national summary. But recently, there's been an attempt by a model called Eurograduate to capture data in a consistent fashion across Europe. So 8 countries took part in the first pilot of this last year. And the questions of that, you can see in the diagram at the bottom there, the kind of process. The questions were a blend of practical information, such as capturing salary and role, but also some sentiment analysis as well. So are graduates actually happy in the jobs they're doing? Did they feel that their university prepared them well for work? And these are all increasingly questions that are an important part of graduate destinations surveys and capture. If we look elsewhere in the world, at the US, we see a slightly different picture where they don't have a centralized survey and they just have some guidance from an organization called NACE, which is the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And it's an informal model whereby they've given some guidance on a survey out to the different colleges and universities around the US. And then those universities capture information with the criteria that I've put on the slide there. So the basics of employment status, salary, and further study. And then that data is split out by things like, whether it's from what the source of the data was and the sort of timing and the threshold for response rates. And obviously, response rates are also another really important consideration that we'll come on to through the discussion today, in terms of what percentage of your graduates do you need to capture information on in order to feel confident that you understand the full picture. But the downside of the US model is that it's very fragmented, and therefore the data is very inconsistent. So it's hard to see it as reliable when you look at it as a national picture. Whereas I think, as you'll hear from Brooke and Rachel a little bit later, the UK model is considerably more sort of structured. So I'm going to stop there and just with that brief bit of scene setting, I'll stop sharing my slides, and hopefully that's provided a little bit of context just to the models that exist around the world before we sort of zoom in to the UK and particular universities. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin. A really nice introduction, and it sets the scene well for your later sessions and the breakout sessions. Thank you for that. Colleagues, now I'm delighted to have introduce you to our second speaker. This is Dr. Brooke Storer-Church. Now, she is the head of skills at the Office for Students, and they are all known here in the UK as OFS, which was set up as our regulator really for higher education in 2018, and has a jurisdiction really for England only, not in Scotland or Wales, Northern Ireland. But we're really delighted that Brooke can join us, because the OFS really plays such an important, critical role for our universities and colleges in England, and we're delighted she can join us today. She's worked on lots of range of kind of critical areas in terms of graduate employability, including AI postgraduate conversion courses. She's focused very much on postgraduate policy and programs, STEM provision, and also focused some of her work around the Degree Apprenticeship Development Fund. So a real broad experience that Dr. Brooke's bringing us today, and we're really grateful for your time, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. Let me see if I can now share my screen with you, which will hopefully assist in what I was going to say. All righty. Now, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. All right. Fantastic. So thanks again so much for inviting me and for the lovely introduction, Richard. I am indeed the head of skills for the OFS, which, as Richard mentioned, is fairly new. It was just set up through an act of Parliament in 2017, which established the first higher education regulator of England, crucially only England. We work to deliver 4 objectives. Our objectives are that all students from all backgrounds and with the ability and desire to undertake education should, 1, be supported to access, succeed in, and progress from higher education. So that really captures our access and participation remit. 2, that they should receive high quality academic experiences, that their interests are protected while they study, and especially in the event of provider, campus, or course closure. So this captures really our remit in quality assurance and also financial sustainability of providers. 3, that students should be able to progress into employment or further study, and that their qualifications hold their value over time. So this really is my remit, as well as a number of our other registration conditions. And 4, that students should receive value from money, and that's a nebulous objective, but one that captures a number of our activities and obviously data captures. So all of the work that we do at the Office for Students works to deliver one or more of those objectives. And as I mentioned, my policy area is primarily concerned with the 3rd objective, which is the reason that I was invited here today. It absolutely is concerned with the extent to which our graduates progress into either further study or ultimately highly skilled employment. So I thought it would be helpful just to take, if my slide will move. There we go. I thought it would be helpful to just take a quick look at what that data is for our sector. So we regulate at provider level, and this is aggregated data for our entire English sector. So what we see then when we look at these tables are our progression rates for full-time graduates. We see a positive trend with rates increasing from about just over 66% in 2012-13 academic year up to just under 74% in 2016-17. Part-time on the right-hand side is obviously a bit more mixed. Ultimately, we see a dip, but we see progress from that same time series. So by 2016-17, our progression numbers amongst part-time students are higher. when we use these data to observe trends in progression, we identify then where improvements can be made. And at the moment, obviously, we've been wrestling for quite a long time with how to provide further supports for part-time students. Part of our remit as the regulator is also to diversify the sector in terms of types of students and types of provision, and to test whether they can be correlated with more positive progression rates. So that's the type of things that I get my head stuck into. What is that progression data based on, you might wonder? It's obviously not just on student data captured in the time that they're enrolled at providers, because this really concerns what they do after they finish their degrees or their other qualifications. So the types of data and metrics we use to monitor progression rates I've put here, and I'll just talk through those quite quickly. Our regulation as the Office of Outcomes is based on student achievement rates as collected by providers themselves and submitted to HESA, which is the Higher Education Statistic Agency, to which we have access. We initially then, after those achievement rates, to then look at progression rates after achievement, we looked at the DELI survey, which is here on the left. And this surveyed graduates 6 months after leaving higher education. The sector, though, has now moved on to a new survey called the Graduate Outcomes Survey. And this seeks to improve on DELI, which we would call the DELI survey, the Destinations of Leavers of Higher Education, by capturing survey responses at 15 months. And that's in recognition of the fact that many graduates need longer than 6 months to find post-study employment. And they may need longer than that to find highly skilled employment or the type of job that aligns best with the subject they studied and their broader career ambitions. Additionally, the Graduate Outcomes Survey asks questions about meaningfulness and graduate well-being and whether they feel like they acquired the right types of skills. So it's really a much broader survey, which does have the potential to give us much richer qualitative data around the kind of all-encompassing outcome rather than just job destination. Alongside this survey, the Graduate Outcomes Survey, we now also have the Longitudinal Educational Outcomes data set, which is often referred to by as LEO. We don't use the LEO data set in our regulation of providers, but increasingly students want to know more about what type of salary they might earn in a given career. And providers are curious about this, of course, as well, because they have league tables by which they judge their performance against other competitors. And this is another metric that's starting to play up in that. So this data is published on student-facing websites, which is a main resource for prospective students, and it's available elsewhere. We're currently consulting with the sector on revising our approach to regulating quality and standards. We have a consultation that's just come in. We're in the middle of 2 phases of it. And we're asking providers whether the LEO data set or other salary measures should feature in our regulation going forward. We're also asking about adopting the Graduate Outcomes Survey in a more comprehensive fashion as a performance measure. So these things are live and they are moving and breathing, and we're trying to respond with them. Finally, I thought, you really can't say anything about graduates moving into the labor market without naming the elephant in the room. So while we have been regulating universities and colleges, it's obviously really up to them to provide the type of teaching and learning and pastoral support that will enable students to progress into the labor market or further study. But of course, whether a graduate finds that the right type of employment for them isn't down to universities alone. And I know I don't need to tell any of you that. The pandemic has certainly underlined the importance of the labor market as its own force. And we're working with the sector and government now to provide additional supports to students graduating this year, as we did in 2020. Both cohorts of which are facing a much steeper journey than they originally anticipated. However, on a bright side, recent analysis of employer recruitment in the UK following the pandemic suggests that graduates will fare much better than non-graduates, and that reflects the value the labor market still places on higher education qualifications. So perhaps even more now, after we've seen differential impacts the pandemic has had on occupations and different types of communities in the UK in particular. So I hope this is very quick, I realize, but I hope it gives you some idea of how we're approaching the regulation of graduate outcomes across the sector in England. And I'll hand over to Rachel now, who will give you a university's perspective on all of this. Thanks, Richard. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brooke. so much to discuss later in the breakout session. And as you've already said, we're going to be now hearing from Rachel McIntosh, who is now currently the Deputy Director of Student Employability at Aston University, where she leads the university's award-winning Careers and Placements Department. Now, Rachel has had various roles in this area for a number of years, including being head of the postgraduate and professional employability department. And she also has spent time overseas as a student, and I'm interested to hear her comments about how that contributes to employability. And she's really driven Aston to be the award-winning university it is now. They have about 82% of all their graduates find good roles in positive destinations, and part of this work has helped the university to be awarded the Guardian's University of the Year last year for 2020, of which graduate employability takes a really important part in the judging of that. So really now we're very interested to hear Rachel's comments, because she's bringing it from this institutional success point of view, from a university's point of view, and we're excited to hear what she says. So Rachel, the floor's yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Richard. I'm just going to share a few slides as well, hopefully. Is that
Yeah, we can see them now, Rachel. Thank you.
You can see them. Lovely. Okay. So thanks very much, Richard, for the introduction, and it's really great to be here today. So I'm going to give an overview on some aspects of our institutional approach to graduate destinations, and why, I guess, understanding and measuring where our graduates are and what they are doing is so important to us, and some of the things that we've learnt over the years that we've been doing this as well. I thought it might be useful just to give a really kind of brief overview of Aston. We are in Birmingham in England, in the middle of the country, and in many ways we're a vocational university. Our heritage is really closely connected to employers and to employability. Employability is absolutely central to our mission, and it's a university level key performance indicator. And as Richard mentioned, over 80% of our graduates are in a positive destination following the first graduate outcomes survey that Brooke gave us a bit more detail on just now. In a normal year, not a COVID year, I hasten to add, typically around 2,000 of our students are out on placement at any given time. And Aston is ranked the most ethically diverse university in the UK as well. A third of our students come from the West Midlands region that we are based in, and that's something that we're also very proud of as well. So Brooke has outlined or given a whistle-stop kind of overview of the national approach to measuring graduate outcomes via the survey. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on what we do within the university itself. We take a really proactive approach to contacting graduates, and we use a whole range of methods to do that. And Martin kind of alluded to earlier whether, those methods sometimes are quite structured and quite formalized, and also quite informal. And I think the thing that's important here is to think about how that information is captured in some ways, rather and recorded, rather than the process that you go through to get there, if that makes sense. So we do things like phone calls, emails, messages, social media. We run a calling campaign, and we have a really small team, a team of 2, that is dedicated to supporting graduates and to reaching out to graduates shortly after graduation to find out more about where they're at and what they're doing. We use existing internal data to identify graduates that might be more at risk, and we prioritise our contact with them initially. So, for example, we know that graduates that have done a placement are more likely to be in graduate level employment. So our starting point is those without a placement, or those that haven't had any engagement with our careers team during their university degree programme. Having really good mechanisms for recording data and segmenting the information that we get means that we can be more sophisticated in where we use our resource you know, and like lots of organisations, we have to choose and prioritise what we do. And so having those processes in place is really essential. Our initial outreach to graduates is focused on continuing support from the university and the careers team. So it helps us to identify who might be under or unemployed, and we can then offer tailor activities for our graduates to engage in. Engagement can be challenging. You know, once graduates leave university, being in contact with the university isn't always their priority. But we found that a university-wide approach beyond just the careers team is essential for this. And so we work really closely with our marketing and alumni teams in a collaborative way. We set up a university-wide graduate outcomes group with representatives from across the university, and that's helped increase the visibility of the graduate destinations agenda within the university. The outreach work is also a great opportunity to hear about graduate success stories, and it's a great opportunity for case studies and things that can be shared with other graduates and prospective students. So that kind of ties back into, you know, the reasons why that's really important to think about graduate destinations and how they influence the university brand, as well as support graduates to be in the destination that they want to be in and using their degree. The Graduate Outcomes Survey provides a really important backdrop for the wider institutional picture. So that's around kind of graduate success as a whole, but also subject level data. So this has been a great tool internally for me and my team to influence employability activity within the curriculum, for example. And the sector level comparison at subject level helps to paint a really important picture of institutional challenges. So as an example, 80% of our mechanical engineering graduates might be in a positive destination, but actually against the sector, that would be a really weak performance. That would place you kind of at the bottom of the table. Whereas in another subject, 80% might be a really kind of excellent performance. So taking that data both at institutional level and using what you already have internally and kind of cross-referencing that with the national picture that we get through the Graduate Outcomes Survey is a really important part of our approach. I just also wanted to touch on, has that come up, my fourth slide?
Yes, it has. Yeah.
It has. Oh, great. Sorry, it's not shifted over on my screen for some reason. We've introduced a number of different initiatives to support graduates in the pandemic, and you know, as Brooke alluded to, the world has very much changed for our students and graduates at the moment in terms of entering the labour market and getting work experience. I mentioned at the beginning that we have a really large volume of students on a placement programme, and that's an integrated year for most students in industry as the third year of a 4-year undergraduate degree. And so this year we've had to reinvent that placement model, and we've implemented an approach to maximise placement uptake and hopefully enable students to get the best experience possible despite the challenging labour market, and that really supports long-term graduate outcomes. A menu of sort of different placement options is available to students, and they've been able to put different experiences together to constitute a full placement year. We're working on a funded internship programme for our 2020 graduates to upskill them and undertake internal opportunities at the university. And this is to try and mitigate some of the challenges within the labour market, both in terms of finding work, but also in terms of finding paid work experience, which is another challenge for graduates in particular at the moment. Our careers consultants have added a new kind of outreach approach to their work with finalists, particularly identifying those at risk that have either not done a placement or because of the pandemic have had that experience cut short and terminated. We're also in the process of designing a bespoke package of skills and resilience support for 2021 grads, and this will potentially be delivered by an external organisation. And I think that's something that we've become more aware of in the last few years is also looking at experts that exist outside of universities, you know, within the sector that can really support our graduate destinations and our graduate outcomes agenda. And the last thing there is just a communications package so that graduates understand that, you know, we are still a really important part of their journey beyond graduation, and there are lots of things that they can do and engage in with us. And then the final slide just focuses really on how we involve students and industry and other stakeholders in the process. We really value the input of all of our stakeholders, but particularly students, graduates and employers. It's very central to our approach in developing the skills that are most needed and valued by employers. And we do that through a number of different mechanisms, feedback surveys. Employers also feature in our curriculum, and we use them to help develop our degree programmes, and they feed that information in via industry advisory boards, for example. Finally, staff and student committees are an important mechanism for internal feedback, and they really help us to respond to student needs and demand. And as you can imagine, the graduate outcomes is central to our employability strategy, and gathering feedback from students and employers was a vital part to developing that strategy. So I hope that gives you a flavour for our approach to graduate outcomes at Aston, and I look forward to seeing some of you in breakout room later on.
Very good, Brooke. Thank you so much, Rachel. That's really interesting oversight from a institutional point of view. It's prompted a couple of questions already. I've seen a question there about an indication. Is there any indications that in the last year have graduates had to settle for employment below the level of their expectations? And I suppose that's I'd be interested to hear. I know there probably isn't comprehensive data yet, but from you, Rachel, from your point of view, from your graduates, Rachel, coming out last year, do you have any indications yet? I assume they have done because of the COVID and a shrinking of the economy. But any kind of immediate comments?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right in terms of formal data's not there yet, and actually because of the new graduate outcomes survey in the UK and the time lag of 15 months after graduation, it will be some time before we have that from the survey perspective. But we've seen a drop in graduate opportunities at Aston by around about 20%, and in the sector it's probably somewhere between 12 and 13%. So we do know that we have more graduates that are not in graduate level employment at the moment directly as a result of the pandemic. Hence some of those kind of activities that I mentioned earlier in terms of trying to mitigate some of those challenges. Yeah,
no, thanks so much for that. And there's one other question I'll just address because anyone in is around from Tamara asking about other statistics out there on models. Perhaps Martin can think about this. Any statistics on models out there at the moment about graduates who work, their work is aligned to their diploma, their area of expertise, or those that don't. I suppose it's difficult to know if you're studying medieval poetry and then go and work in another kind of occupation that's not teaching English. But any immediate comments? We'll go into breakout rooms after. Any immediate comments you got on that?
Yeah, the data on that kind of resides at a number of levels. So the graduate outcome survey that Brooke and Rachel have been talking about gives us differential data on that by the different subjects. So it varies hugely, obviously, from things like medicine and education, where people in the main do go into work related to their study, to other subjects, perhaps like you say, like English, where it's much more variable. If you look at the employer side of the market, what's really interesting in the UK, which is different to some other markets, particularly different, for example, to the US, is that around 75% of graduate employers don't specify a degree in their job adverts or in their graduate schemes. So they're not particularly interested what subject you studied. They're much more interested increasingly in your underlying capabilities as a graduate rather than necessarily what subject. Obviously that's different if you're hiring for engineers. You definitely need engineering graduates, but for most mainstream graduate schemes in a lot of subjects, yeah, there isn't the same. There's a non-linear route in a lot of cases, certainly in the UK and in quite a bit of Europe as well. I think you're on mute. Sorry, Richard, at the moment.
Thank you, Martin. And just checking, Brooke, any kind of initial comments you had on those two issues before we go to breakout rooms?
No, not from me. Thank you.
Okay, good. So we'll spend the next 25 minutes together really more discussion mode. You've heard a kind of opening statements and kind of key issues raised. Let's go now to discussion mode. Now, this is how it's going to work. I'm going to be staying here with Brooke, and we'll be focusing around what the actual government level is doing, collecting data. And some of you will be taken automatically to a breakout room focused on institutions and what universities are doing. And then the third breakout room will be focused very much about what data should be collected. So 3 interesting topics happening, and I think you'll be taken there automatically unless I have any other instructions from my colleague Summer. Summer, why don't you tell us what's happened next, and then we'll get back together as a main group in about half an hour. We'll hear feedback from our speakers. But Summer, over to you for any instructions.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think that's very clear. Just to say that I think Martin has a case study that he wants to share with us on the work that they have been doing to support Azerbaijan before we go into the breakout room discussion.
Very good. Okay, we'll do that now. Very good. Martin, let's hear a case study first then.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so I'm just going to share a case study from some work we've recently been doing with the Ministry of Education in Azerbaijan and the British Council. So just one moment while I share a couple of slides. And I guess just to give you an example of the development of these kind of models in the region where most of you are joining us from today across the wider Europe region. So we recently were invited by a combination of the Ministry of Education in Azerbaijan and the British Council to come and work with them in partnership on the development of a kind of graduate outcomes destination model for Azerbaijan. Now, the Ministry of Education in Azerbaijan, who I think they're represented here by Javad Mustafazadeh, who's here with us today, I think as well, worked very closely with us to help us to give them some guidance really on different models around the world. Because in Azerbaijan, they've got quite a wide-ranging higher education system that they've built that underpins university and higher education in general. And as part of that, they were keen to develop almost like a module to that system, which captures graduate destinations, and so that they can better understand what happens to the graduates in Azerbaijan once they've left university. So, as you can see from there, in partnership, we look to work on how we could best monitor subsequent employment of graduates, how to collect graduate contact details, how to handle the kind of communication between graduates and employers and businesses, and then also how to track people through their education journey from starting university and out into the labour market, and then how we understand how they've progressed. So to do that, we initially spent some time with the Ministry of Education, with the British Council, understanding current strategies and systems and things. And then we went away and wrote a report that factored in some of the activity going on in the universities in Azerbaijan at the moment, but also what we know of in models around the world, and particularly, obviously, the model that Brooke and Rachel were describing around the graduate outcomes model in the UK, and what can be perhaps pulled in or learned from that model. One of the start points for this was understanding current data collection in Azerbaijan around graduate destinations. So we spoke to a focus group of universities, some of which you can see there on the screen. And what was really interesting was that quite a lot of the universities were already trying to collect graduate destinations data, but in quite a sort of varied fashion in terms of the timescale they were collecting it, or perhaps the method they were using. Some had quite a lot of resource to do that, and others were having to kind of do that with less resource. So there was a bit of a challenge in terms of consistency and how you maintain contact details and how you generate good response rates. But what was very consistent was a really strong appetite amongst the universities there for improved and potentially for centrally collected data, so that there was kind of really robust data that they could better understand what happens to their graduates after they leave the university. So we took that away. We did a bit of an analysis of various reports. We looked into the information we were given by the ministry, and we provided a detailed report, but just wanted to give you perhaps some very, very short-hand sort of headlines from that report. The report obviously was a lot more detailed than this, but some of the headlines that emerged really were that around the world, as we sort of mentioned earlier, the majority of models collect their data from the graduates rather than from employers. It can be tempting to collect it from employers, but actually that's often quite complicated. And what you don't get is the first-hand information from the graduates. However, actually, in some countries, it may be possible to collect data from employers via almost real-time data. So, for example, in Azerbaijan, there is a system that all employers use to capture their kind of HR information in their businesses. And so obviously that captures things like who their employees are and what they're getting paid and things like that. So there is the possibility to pull data from that into this kind of survey. So the sort of linked data that I was referencing earlier and that Brooke was talking about with the Leo data in the UK. We were sort of suggesting that you could try and do this on a real-time basis, but actually perhaps it makes most sense to pick a fixed point in time at which you do this survey. And as it says on there, 6 months is usually the most internationally recognized point after graduation that the surveys take place. So in the US, in Australia, in quite a lot of Europe, it's generally done at 6 months after university where you would collect that data. And really, the guidance we sort of gave was really about starting by collecting the fundamental information first. So, you know, jobs, titles, industries, salaries, and then potentially moving forward from that once you've established a really robust collection model with a combination of phone calls or surveys and digital surveys, then perhaps start broadening out once you've got good response rates to things like you know, graduate sentiment. So, you know, are graduates happy with the job they've got? Is it in line with the degree they did? And is it using the skills they developed at university? And finally, our last recommendation tallies very much with what Rachel was saying, really, which is that it's really important in the development of any of these systems, either at a national level or at a university level, to involve your stakeholders in the design and the delivery of it. So involve universities, employers, and graduates in the design so that you build a way of collecting graduate destinations that actually people are really bought into and find straightforward and that is simple in terms of things like capturing contact information and then how you gather the information, and avoiding things like surveys that are overlong or overcomplicated that then can often reduce response rates. So we've shared that, presented that to the ministry in Azerbaijan just a couple of weeks ago, and that's now underway and in development, and the team there are progressing that. So I think it's a really positive development to see there, and we thought it would be a useful case study example both to share with you and hopefully stimulate further discussion in the breakout rooms.
Colleagues from other groups have been flooding back in from their own discussions, and so I'm not going to turn to Brooke for her commentary yet. In fact, I'll give her the opportunity to go last out of the three, so she can somehow string what we've heard together as our trip went from Azerbaijan to Uzbekistan to Turkey to the UK. So there are lots to pull on. Welcome back, everyone. That was a really fascinating interest. That just shows me how I didn't realise actually just how broad this topic was and how many different complications there were to it. And so it makes my role as moderator, driving back to the original question, even tougher. But actually, you know, let's get back there. This is really about how can universities enhance their brand by measuring graduate out destinations and outcomes. That's our exam question. And with that in mind, in this wrap-up session, we have around 50 minutes left. So first of all, I'm going to ask Martin to first of all try and synthesize or kind of give his commentary on the discussion in his group. So Martin, floor's yours.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, we had a really, really interesting discussion in our group, and from similarly, we went from, you know, from Uzbekistan to Ukraine to Nigeria and various other places as well. So it was a really interesting conversation. I think a few things that emerged. One was around some of the models of collection, some really interesting stuff from Uzbekistan. You know, use of system, you know, things like Telegram as a means of maintaining contact information and capturing data and things that are kind of, you know, really speedy level and getting some really amazing response rates, in fact, to then on graduate destination surveys from a university there. So that was really, really interesting, but also seeing how there was a clear link there between performance in graduate destinations by individual courses and then those courses being allowed to kind of grow and recruit additional student numbers, because it was seen as a very positive indicator of performance at an institutional and a course level to have delivered good graduate outcomes. Similar story in Ukraine. At a national level, they're moving, seem to be moving towards a model where part of the funding for universities is going to be tied to their performance in graduate destinations and graduate outcomes, which again will be very familiar to those people who have UK universities, because to some extent that's a model that has taken place in the UK as well, albeit wrapped up in a slightly different way. So there's a kind of model there, which has both controversial elements, because not everyone thinks that you should evaluate higher education by graduate destinations, but obviously it also has positive things, because it's surely a good thing that universities take seriously developing the employability of their graduates. And then finally, we heard from a kind of Nigerian perspective in terms of how it's also sometimes a challenge where you perhaps either haven't got great national data, so you have to develop your own as an institution, but also thinking particularly about enterprise as a pathway as well as jobs being an important part of the kind of ecosystem of this, and collecting that data as well, so that where you perhaps haven't got the graduate jobs for everyone to go into, you can then potentially support people via enterprise pathways, and that's a positive graduate destination that needs to be captured as well.
So thank you, Martin. That's quite a broad range of things. Thank you, very interesting. I wonder if we could go then now perhaps to Rachel McIntosh, and just from your group, be useful to hear how your discussions went, any kind of key themes that came out in your focus.
Yeah, sure, Richard. We had some really interesting discussions as well, and people shared a couple of different kind of processes for how they were collecting graduate destinations and some of the associated challenges. We heard from an institution with 100% employability, which I said was just a dream that I could aspire to at some point in the future, where the rector knows graduates by name and is in touch with them 2 or 3 years later, and that there's a really that just collecting that information is just part of what's always been done, so they haven't had to put a kind of a new process in place, and it's actually shared annually in a publication about where the graduates are and what graduates are doing, and kind of really celebrated in that way. So that was really interesting. But that there was a kind of broader national challenge about understanding the labour market and having labour market information and labour market intelligence to know whether they were actually developing skills that were needed, or that they were in a position to respond to some of those challenges. And then we also heard from I'm really sorry because I can't remember where the other institution was based, from another institution where they initially were collecting graduate destinations 9 months after graduation, but they were finding that really challenging. Graduates didn't want to answer their calls or speak to them. Uzbekistan, thank you. So they changed their process and actually built in graduate destinations questions into the process that graduates have to go through to collect their diploma. And so they can't collect their diploma unless they respond to questions about where they are and what they're doing, and that's resulted in them finding out that there's about 70% of their graduates in graduate destinations, and then they do some sort of targeted work with the other 30%. Yeah, so that was it really. Had some good conversations.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and sounded interesting. A breakout room, and then finally to Brooke, just to kind of pull out her thoughts and observations from the third breakout group. Thank you.
Well, unsurprisingly, we also had an interesting discussion trying to tackle some of the issues that Rachel just mentioned, actually, which is that looking at things from a national level. So our kind of key question was what data should be collected nationally, or what are governments doing to gather data and monitor graduate outcomes broadly. We spoke around about a few different experiences. We heard from one of our colleagues in Turkey around the lack of a centralized student survey system and the limitations that presents, the limitations around having data that would define an upskilling system. So what approaches could you have at national level to provide options to continue to engage graduates, to help them progress in their careers once they do have graduate employment? We heard from Alyssa at Westminster, who gave some really good examples of how she and her colleagues in the alumni office are working across their institution, so across the alumni relations team, the graduate employability team, and even the short courses team to develop an offer that seeks to engage graduates before they become graduates, and then once they're graduates, and then for quite a long time, up to 3 years or more after, in order to provide an ongoing offer. And indeed, I can say from my perspective, we have seen multiple institutions extend their offer to graduates in the face of the pandemic to underline the support that the careers services, for example, can offer. We talked about whether or not students were aware of the skills that they gained. So is it maybe an issue of capturing data at a national level? And is it also about upskilling graduates with the language they need to articulate the skills and therefore improve their employability by just kind of harnessing what they already have developed as capabilities? There was broad recognition that national data is necessary for a number of reasons. It's in growing in importance, certainly in Uzbekistan, in order to demonstrate to graduates, or prospective students rather, what the value is of undertaking a degree or higher education. It's a value to universities in order to demonstrate their impact. And of course, it's valuable to any government or university sector that wants to be able to demonstrate whether they are delivering that match of skills, that point that Rachel just measured. You know, how do you know that you're producing graduates that are going to go into jobs that are available and that where there's a need in the labor market? I think that generally captured the headlines I took from. I might, you know, invite Richard, if you think I lost anything that was important to you, please throw it in. But I think it was a really interesting conversation. Really great to hear from other people around the world about what they're doing.
No, thank you. Very useful summary, Brooke, from a wide-ranging number of points. Thank you. And again, geographically split. So we have about 10 minutes left, and this is an opportunity for any. So feel free to ask or pitch them into the chat. I have one follow-up question that I wanted to ask Martin. It was really around this alignment of the of universities and labour market, and with your perspective, you know, of other parts of the world and the UK. And we just wondered, looking forward to the future, next 5-10 years, I suppose the question is, you know, what sectors of the labour market are currently least aligned to the graduate outflow from universities? Where are we going to see where are we going to see the most shift for universities to alter courseware or develop courses to match the future labour market?
It's a very good question, Richard, and I think it's one that actually a lot of people have struggled with for decades, which is how you really usefully look 5 years ahead in terms of the labour market and then somehow align educational provision to kind of flow in with that. I think perhaps I'm going to slightly dodge the question, but perhaps steer towards some of what a couple of other people have said already. Brooke and Rachel, I think, have said already as well, which is that actually I think the way things are going to shift, if anything, is more towards an overall kind of skills-based economy, a skills-based kind of model, where actually employers are less fixated on an industry or a job title, and they're more kind of interested in the kind of underlying set of attributes and competencies that a graduate can deliver on a more flexible basis, because obviously jobs are going to shift and morph over that kind of time through a combination of technology. We've seen the change that the pandemic has brought in terms of remote working. So I think if anything, actually, the emphasis for alignment will be for universities to just be very close to the underlying skills and attributes that are being looked for across industries, rather than necessarily trying to keep thinking, well, you know, the engineering industry needs this, so I need to have a course that does that, and then the, you know, medicine needs this. There'll still need to be liaison, obviously, between those kind of industries and the departments that are very directly related, and I think that goes on already. But I think at a kind of, if you like, a kind of macro global sense, I think it's going to be much more about developing graduates who have a really well honed and well understood and well articulated set of attributes that they can then apply as the labour market flexes and changes, and are therefore useful to organisations more generally. That would be my sort of take on the next few years.
Thank you for that. And I want to lead that same theme through to my sort of final question to Brooke, and focus around those underlying skills that Martin talked about. What data do we have from OFS do we have data that shows an international experience in your time at university contributes to better employability? Do we have any as part of the underlying skill set that graduates can work across different cultures, work in teams and so on? Do we have anything? Are the data collection areas around that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We have data that shows correlation between Erasmus years, for example, and positive graduate outcomes. However, we can't disaggregate that data enough to isolate the correlation specifically to the international study, because we know that students who undertake international studies tend to be more proactive students, engaging themselves in opportunities to help them progress. They seem to be, they tend to come from more advantaged backgrounds. They tend to seek work experience opportunities. They tend to do the other types of behaviors that we would expect to see also aligned with positive graduate attributes. So I think it's hard to pinpoint in data that this exactly will do it for you. And this is a dodgy answer, but this is where common sense really comes in. I mean, for any of us who have ever traveled abroad, for work or for pleasure, much less studied abroad, we know that it forces you to confront a whole set of your own expectations about how things should be done, should smell, should look. And that's a healthy reflection, I think. And any of us who have done that repeatedly have learned to appreciate things that are different from where we have come. And actually, that can be even in small measures. You don't have to leave the UK to do that. What we're trying to work on is getting some of our students from the north to come down south. We have limited graduate mobility. It's much more limited than we originally thought it was. But it's a broad issue that I think countries will deal with internally as well as outside of their borders. And more mobility and more engagement with others can only be a positive, because it will absolutely deliver the types of skills that Martin was mentioning and that we know will benefit our graduates, like flexibility, open-mindedness, the ability to work in a team, the ability to be culturally sensitive, the ability to nuance your own communication styles to others. And digital technologies will make that all the more relevant, and flexible working will make that all the more possible and necessary. And so it will be something we'll have to confront openly, I think, with our students as we go ahead.
Thank you, Brooke. A really interesting take on that. And I want to turn now to Rachel, in some ways to consider those points about, traditionally universities offered, these kind of big, long, lengthy courses, 3 or 4 years or 2 years for masters and so on. Is that going to remain? Is that going to satisfy labour market demands, do you think, or are we going to see a whole range of microcredits and smaller tailored courses to complement or to replace those kind of traditional academic-based degrees? Again, this is future looking, but I wondered how you saw Aston's approach to modifying courseware and modifying qualifications.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Richard. And I think, we are seeing a shift away from traditional courses in the UK, although, a British education is still kind of held up as a model around the world that lots of places aspire to. But at Aston, we've seen a real increase in the approach with degree apprenticeships, for example. And so that's a much more, employer-based and employer-led way of students getting a degree, rather than, the traditional degree where you're at university for 3 years, potentially 4 if you do a placement. So I think we will see more of that model. I also think that we'll see more flexibility within degree programs and what students can do at different points of degree programs, and other parts of the world do that better already. Like for America, for example, where students can swap in and out of different parts of their degree, take a period of study abroad, replace credits, replace modules. The system in the UK at the moment isn't massively flexible for that, but I think that's something that we'll need to look at more and to develop more as well.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and that's really interesting to hear that the dynamism happening and the change of approach and the flexibility. That brings us really to the final part of our focus session. I'm going to give our speakers, again, just a kind of 20 or 30 seconds in a minute, just for their final thoughts and wrap-ups on this key topic around how can universities enhance their brand by measuring graduate destinations and outcomes. Any final thoughts on that? It's okay if you don't, but if you do, I'll go in the same order. and final closing comments from Martin.
I think my just quick summary would be to say that whilst there are some downsides to some graduate data and outcomes collection methods and things, and they can be used in ways that people aren't always comfortable with, like league tables and rankings, actually what I have seen overwhelmingly is an increased drive behind them to enhance the employability of students and graduates in universities, and that's fundamentally, I think, a good thing that they help drive and deliver. So I think that's why I think they have a really positive role to play.
That's great. Thank you, Martin. And obviously, Gradcore has such a wealth of experience to help all institutions and to focus on that. Brooke, great to get your comments. Final closing.
I honestly, I think I'm still digesting everything that everyone has had to take, and certainly I've been asked so many really good constructive questions. I'd say, it is absolutely important to do what you can do in the space that you can do it. So I think at times we can get frustrated by what's not happening at national level, and certainly at national level working, I get frustrated where I can see pockets where things aren't going where we are, but we can only really focus on what we can do. And I think, as long as we proceed forward, everyone working at institutions, no matter where you are in the world, if you take this learning back to your own institution, you do that and do that well, and then you can link up in future with others. So try to move the piece of the puzzle you can move, I suppose, is my only really final thought. Yeah,
that's very reassuring. Thank you from our national regulator to not be too frustrated. That we're going to be bit by bit, especially in this COVID environment. And finally, Rachel, to you, any closing comments of what you've heard today around this, given your institution?
I don't think I have anything different to add really from what Martin and Brooke have said. It's been a really interesting conversation and really great to see what else is happening in other places, and also from an institutional perspective, what I can learn from that as well and take back to my own institution. So thank you very much.
Thank you all, and thank you all for the three speakers. That brings us to the close of our for this Higher Education Dialogue series, the deep dive into measuring and improving graduate destination outcomes. Just to let you know that there's a survey going around now on the chat, just to get your feedback immediately. It'll take just mere minutes to kind of fill that out to complete it, and also to remind you that the Spotlight report, like a summary of this discussion, will be circulated next week from this discussion. So with that, I'll bring it to a close. Just want to thank our three speakers again for their time and their kind of how they've tackled all these areas, and all of you for joining on a Friday afternoon in your countries, and wish you all a very good and peaceful weekend. Thank you very much.